Hey, Newlife, welcome to Wednesday on our extended Facebook time going through the book of Acts. My name is Heather Hetzendorfer. Happy to be here with you guys. We're going through Acts 13. Today is the 13th. So what I'd love to do, my style of going through this is just taking each verse, kind of each section, and just kind of going through it at a time. So if you haven't read Acts 13 yet, you are welcome to just open up the book right now and start going through it with me together. So first of all, it opens up introducing the church in Antioch, which is the first multicultural church of Jews and Gentiles together, which is a super cool thing. And then the writer lists that there are 5 prophets that are here in this church. How cool is that? That there's 5 prophets and teachers, and he elaborates on that in the first paragraph. And while these 5 prophets and teachers were together, they started praying and fasting and just asking the Lord, what do we do now? They had just come out of a season of persecution and them all being scattered across to different nations to escape. But beautifully, the Lord used that to multiply and extend his church. So this is, again, the first church of Jews and Gentiles together. They're fasting and praying, God, what do we do next? And the Lord speaks to them, and they all 5 hear that they are to separate Paul and Barnabas for a new mission. So this is now the first missionary calling, the first organized missionary calling of Paul and Barnabas being sent out. And it's so cool when you read the verses, it doesn't say that as soon as they heard this from fasting and praying, they immediately sent them off. It says that they finished fasting and praying. So after they hear the word of the Lord, they stay with their commitment. So whatever that was, maybe they were only fasting for 3 days, and day 1 the Lord spoke. We don't know, but all we know is that as soon as the Lord spoke, they still continued to finish their fasting and praying to confirm it, and then they sent them off. And I love that. I remembered when I was living in Sydney, Australia, my senior pastor down there shared a story of how he had this burning in his heart when he was around 18 to 20 years old to start a church. He knew once he got radically saved as a hippie that he was supposed to start a church. And he flew over from New Zealand to Sydney, Australia. And he landed, got started, and everything failed. And the Lord said, this is not the right time. So he flew back to New Zealand, went back to his old job, felt the burning coming in again, flew over the second time, same thing happened. The Lord said, I did not send you yet. And he came back a 3rd time, and he just like, okay, I just surrender this completely. And he waited on the Lord. And then he was finally heard the release and went to Sydney, Australia, where he started a church. He's been running it for 30 years now. But it's powerful for us to remember that when we have that burning desire in our heart, that we don't rush into it, that we stop and actually wait for the Lord's calling, because sometimes it's just a seed and he needs to continue watering it. So here they are, they're released. They're the first missionaries sent out. Verse 5, John Mark goes with him, which is kind of interesting because he's an assistant, and John Mark, which I did not know this, is the same Mark who writes the Gospel of Mark. So he's an assistant who goes with Paul and Barnabas. Verse 6, they head to Paphos, where the altar of Venus, the goddess of love, actually exists. So there's this spirit of seduction and lust and fornication present in this city where Paul and Barnabas are sent. So they enter the town, and as soon as they enter, the assistant of the Roman government, the assistant of the Proconsul, actually comes out to them and says, hey, my boss, the Proconsul of the Roman government, wants to meet with you guys and has questions for you. So they go and meet the Proconsul and start talking. And while they're talking, this assistant starts challenging every single thing that Paul and Barnabas were saying and challenging his faith. And because of this, he was greatly confused. And Paul was getting so angry. There was such a demonic presence over this assistant that Paul speaks to him and curses him and commands that darkness comes over his eyes. And because of that, he actually goes blind, which is ironically the same way that Paul was converted. Here he was crucifying all the Christians, and the Lord woke him up by blinding his eyes. And now Paul does this to this other individual who was creating chaos. It's crazy to think about how the Roman government was such a closed off position for the gospel of Christ, but this guy comes and pursues Paul and Barnabas. And then the enemy's like, nope, I'm not gonna let that happen. I'm gonna stop that right away. And he had a plan. But it's cool to see how the power of light from heaven invades this dark moment, and Paul brings a miracle and causes the proconsul to turn towards the Lord in verse 12. So here, after this happens, we hear that that John Mark leaves Barnabas and Paul. We don't know why he left, but he left. And this creates a frustration later on in chapter 15. We learn that Paul was actually really angry that John Mark leaves them. So we don't know why, but he leaves. They continue on to go to a Pisidian Antioch church. And this is beautiful to see how the Lord moves through this situation. So it talks about how they arrive on Sabbath and then they just sit there and wait for the service to end, and they wait to be approached by the leaders in that synagogue, and they ask them to speak. And this is where you get this powerful, it's about 20 verses that Paul preaches to them and causes them to turn from their ways. And what's incredible, at the very end, you see the entire region comes to know Jesus Christ. And the Gentiles believe. Now the Jews got really angry and kicked them out, and that's where the journey of chapter 14 begins, as they move on to another city and continue revolutionizing the gospel in another city. But I love how their reaction at the very end, after they're kicked out of this city, even though the revival breaks out, it says that they were filled with joy and the Holy Spirit. Let's be encouraged during persecution and times of trials to remember that we can still be joyful and full of the Holy Spirit. Love you guys. Enjoy the rest of Acts.